Welcome everybody to Constellations Conversations with me, Robert Rowland Smith, and Nicola Dunn. Hi Nicola, good to see you.
Hi Robert, lovely to see you.
So we thought we would talk today about the topic of shapes in constellations. And I'll just say what we mean by that. When you set up a constellation, we'll normally have a few people in the room, and of course they can be arranged in all sorts of different ways and shapes and forms and geometries. So we thought we'd talk about that today, because those forms and shapes and geometries often carry meaning with them. I've noticed, actually, particularly among people who are new to constellations, and particularly people who are new to training in constellations, actually, that there's a presumption perhaps that a circle is a good shape to have, that there's something inclusive and equal and suggestive of harmony about a circle. But actually there's all sorts of ways in which circles don't work, in my experience, and I'm sure yours too, Nicola. So that's one thing we can talk about, whether a circle is a good shape or not. We often in constellations, particularly family constellations, but also organizational constellations, will have lines set up with people behind one another, particularly in lines of generations, and that can be even more narrowly set up as lines of a particular gender going down generations, like a male line or a female line, for example. So we have circles, we have lines. We also then have all sorts of forms of opposition. And certainly when I'm doing constellations with a new group, I will try and include the circle to bring them into the process as much as possible. And when two people seem to be facing one another in a constellation at some distance, the comment from the group will often be, "Oh, look, it's very confrontational." So there's a kind of tangent, or I don't know, I'm not very good at geometry. There's a line between the two across the room, which seems like an oppositional line, and people interpret that as confrontational. Of course, again, it's not always confrontational at all. And in business constellations, also one other thing I've noticed quite a lot is you do get clusters here and there, which is a bit less common in my experience in family constellations. So there's a few thoughts just to get us going, then we can talk about the theory behind it, maybe the holding circle itself as a circle, and ways in which the kaleidoscope shifts, I suppose, during the course of a constellation. But maybe that's something to get us started, Nicola.
So, I think shapes are fascinating, as you suggest. We know them through nature. They have a boundary, so they have an inner element and an outer element. The circles that we tend to use in constellations have often an open circle, aren't they? They're not necessarily a closed circle. There is a little space where people come and go. And I guess that is a metaphor for what is going to happen over the day. It is interesting to think about triangles, because we come from a triangle as a life, or if there's assisted fertility, it may be more like a square or rectangle. There may be other people who have been involved in that initial conception. But then our first kind of relationships, we often, but not exclusively, but are with a primary carer and whoever supports that carer, whether it's a partner or they're living at home, it's a parent. So we're used to kind of negotiating shapes, and we have a sense of shape. We have a sense of good form and uncomfortable form. And so I know someone who we both know, actually, who's into sacred geometry, who's looked at this sort of architecture of places of worship, and that there are certain, I think, rules around that, or commonalities. So I think shape matters, is what, at least I think we probably both agree on, which is why we've decided to use this as a topic.
I want to pick up on your notion of the triangle there, partly because I had a case of this just last night when I was running a constellation. you described that very nicely. The triangle in the non-assisted generation of the child, you have mum, dad, and child. So that would be the triangle that I think you're referring to. In the constellation I ran last night, it was hard to produce that shape. And in fact, the child positioned themselves between mum and dad. So you had a line rather than a triangle. And for you and me, Nico, that's a bit of a kind of worrying setup in many ways, because what the child is doing essentially is two things. One is they become the glue that bind mum and dad together, as if mum and dad don't bind each other together enough without the glue of the child, which was indeed the case in the constellation last night. And secondly, when a child puts themselves between mum and dad, they're also stepping onto the wrong rung on the generational ladder, as it were. They're aligning themselves with the previous generation, their parents, rather than the generation to which they belong, which is the bottom apex, the bottom point of the triangle. So it's better, I'm sure I've seen this many times, when a child steps forward and looks back at the parents, or indeed looks back and then turns round to face forward away from the parents with their support. That's when the triangle sort of becomes best. And interesting to hear your thoughts on that, Nicola. The other thing in the back of my mind, again, because of my interest in philosophy, Hegel, the German philosopher, writes about love in families and the arrival of a child. And he thinks, for a conservative thinker in many ways, he suggests that it's only with the arrival of the child that the love between mother and father becomes complete. So it's a realization, in Hegel's language, of something that before the arrival of the child is not fully realized. And in fact, Bert Hellinger, if I remember rightly, claims that the love of a couple peaks with the birth of the first child as well. And that may or may not be a kind of triangular thing and might take us off in a different direction. But the notion of kind of the triangle being a good thing, I think, is worth exploring a bit. And I like what you say about it.
It's really interesting. I don't remember Bert saying that, so that I haven't heard that. And I'm interested in it because he didn't have children himself.
Yeah.
So that I love your idea of the, in a sense, I would describe it as this line between two parents and a child when they're sort of equally facing forward is really like a flattened triangle.
Exactly.
And that actually, I think the movement, which is a subtle and actually very tender movement, is when the, in this case, it's going to be an adult child because they're at a workshop normally, but that actually they tentatively take a step forward to experiment. What is it like to establish an apex? Can my parents survive? And will they stay together? And this is obviously the fear when children are younger. Well, if I move out of this shape or position, will the whole edifice of whatever I consider my family to be fall down? And that can be with a parent, and also it can be with a partner's, boyfriend or girlfriend, obviously, one of the partners is not living in the home. So I think it's a really interesting thing. And I'm kind of fascinated by that comment about Bert, about the apex of love being a child, and whether I think it's true is an interesting question. I think maybe there is a creativity there that it's more difficult to get elsewhere, but not impossible. But I'm curious about the aspect of love. I know many couples that are very loving that don't have children. So interesting thought.
It is an interesting thought. Maybe one to come back to. I'm pretty sure I read it in one of his books, and maybe we should have a separate conversation about Bert Hellinger as opposed to other forms of constellations, because I'm increasingly realizing that Bert Hellinger is becoming solidified as the trainings continue and teachings continued as the father of constellations, and disregarding really all the antecedents to Bert Hellinger, and his own debt actually to constellation of practice which came before him. I think there's a bit of adjustment perhaps that needs to be done there, and also I think there are aspects of Bert Hellinger's work which frankly I think are questionable, which perhaps we should discuss at some point. But yes, that's a bracket. So coming back to these different shapes, so a triangle is also pretty rare in a business constellation. What is more common is what I would call, let's say, hub and spoke, or at least sun and moon. In other words, it is actually quite common in an organizational constellation for a circle to begin to appear. And people feel good about that because they can see each other, and there's a sense of common endeavor, I suppose, that's created when a circle is there. And sometimes when I work with a business, I'll ask them, first of all, actually, just to set up the organogram, in other words, the organization chart. So CEO at the top, operations director, sales director, marketing director, just, as the kind of formal grid it would appear if you were to write it down on paper. Because it's an easy way for people to get into constellations if they're unfamiliar with it. So you set up the tree, the organizational tree. And then I say, okay, now go to a position that feels like where the power is distributed in this organization. And of course, a completely different picture then emerges. And the third picture that often, not always, emerges is the circle. However, what is so common in organizational constellations, in my experience, is that the person presenting the issue on behalf of the organization will almost always forget one or both of the following things. Number one, the customer, and number two, the work. So they will set it up as essentially an internal wrangle or difficulty of one kind. So what you end up with is this circle. And so then I, being the sort of slightly Mephistophelian constellation I sometimes am, will then say, okay, well, I think we've forgotten the customer here. So you bring in a customer who's like this satellite over here and this big sun in the middle. And then suddenly it's like, oh, we forgot about the customer. And then the customer is going, what the hell are you lot doing? You're just talking to yourselves. You've forgotten about me completely. And it's made me realize actually that one of the things the customer at a profounder level, I suppose, represents in an organizational constellation is time. Because as soon as the customer comes in, the clock starts ticking on the people inside, and they start thinking, my God, we need to get ourselves organized, or this customer's going to go elsewhere.
Absolutely. At time and competition, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I think it's fascinating. So, it reminds me a little bit. You talked about hub and spoke, and I think it's quite a concept du jour, isn't it? That it's popular. But it helped me think that actually we're talking about shape, but with hub and spoke, it is actually 3D because the hub is actually elevated.
Yes.
I've been involved in situations where there's been a competition about which center is going to be the hub and which are going to be the spokes. It can get quite ruthless, and mostly everybody wants to be the hub because it has that elevation. Even though it's presented as a flat hierarchy, it isn't by any means, and everybody knows that. So it's not like a bicycle wheel.
No, that's absolutely brilliant, Nicola. I love that. And it reminds me, there's a few times, particularly again, people who are new to constellations, I've seen people come into a constellation and immediately try and stand on a chair, so I'm above it all. And I remember doing a constellation for a man who ran a big beverage company, let's call it. And he literally kind of climbed up the wall to this, there was a kind of alcove, and he climbed up in order to be able to oversee it. Now, normally I don't like those kind of theatrics in constellations, but in that case, it was quite instructive because the problem in that business was it was so hard to get any perspective because it was so intricate. People just forming this sort of congealed mass in the center with no breathing space, not enough space between roles and responsibilities, not enough clarity on the task ahead. And so he, representing the boss, basically was just almost as if coming up for air, just needed to breathe in that wider perspective to be able to see it. So that's another version of three-dimensional, I suppose.
And it's interesting because it brings up the issue around power, which is its own topic, and how, you know, power from source or power from edifice. You know, so I also want to come back a little bit to the circle, which is so common, and I don't know if you have the sense, Robert, that actually when we're in a circle, if we're sitting silently, if we're standing in a circle, that there is a concern by the different members of the circle that everyone can see. If somebody's blocked, it concerns them. And it just reminds me that about siblings, that even though siblings, you know, might fight tooth and nail, there is a sense that you are my sibling and you belong, and therefore you should have a, you know, a recognizable place, not be stuck behind the pillar, not be sort of somehow excluded. So the shapes take us into that concept that I mentioned of inclusion and exclusion.
They do, and maybe we should have mentioned this already. You talked about you know, when people gather for a constellation, they sit in a circle. Now, you can be quite purist about being in a circle. I've seen looser circles and things that are more like a horseshoe and more like a square and so on. But nevertheless, we are talking about a circle, and part of the point of that shape is, as you say, I like the way you put it right at the beginning, it has an inside and an outside. And so there is a zone of exclusion, you know, the wild forest, you know, the Arden or purgatory or whatever. It's quite a sort of mythical space in a way, the space outside a constellation circle. Often it's the place where people travel after death, and the dead will often seek to place themselves in that sort of netherworld or intermediate world, and often a place for those who are excluded. But it does have it has a slightly more, I would describe it, slightly more mythological quality, the space outside the circle versus the space inside the circle, which tends to, I'm not happy with this distinction actually, but tends to be a bit more real, I suppose, the space inside the circle.
So I think that, as you say, there are these almost sort of three circles. There is those represented standing in the constellation in the shape that they form. There's the holding circle, which sometimes people move around to, and there's sort of clusterings and changes and activity there. And then there is the third space, which is outside the circle. And of course, people could go outside the door, which is another. But they are demarcated, and they have a different kind of tone to them. And all those three spaces are layered within the issue holder or seeker who's sitting next to you. So it's a kind of interesting revelation of what they're moving with. And that sometimes, you know, if the issue holder themselves on the initial formation goes outside the circle, that's information.
Yes, it is. When you say what they're moving with, that makes me want to also come back to the notion of the line as well as the circle, and in two forms. So first of all, we touched on the genealogical line, that you will often have a representative of the issue holder, their father, the grandfather, the great-grandfather, and sometimes quite a long line, actually, going back 6 or 7 generations. And I think one of the reasons we'll often set up that line is both sort of negative and positive, sort of 2 reasons, in fact. One is to find the source of strength, and 2 is to find the source of entanglement or weakness, or the weak link in the chain, if you like. So we'll often set that up in order to diagnose where the energy, where the energy lies in some way. Again, this constellation evening I was running yesterday, we had a setup with a man, father, grandfather, and the man and the father were both I'll put it very briefly, weak men. And essentially it was because the grandfather was too strong a man, a bully, actually, who'd sort of, in order to assert his own power, essentially, over the next generations, had almost kind of emasculated them. So it's quite, we set up that line in order to identify that point there. And of course, I mean, we went elsewhere for other reasons, but one of the bits of work you would then do with that line is look in turn at the grandfather's own parents and see what it was that had empowered him to behave in this slightly crushing way to the men who came after him.
When you describe that, I was just thinking about the concept of the line.
Yeah.
The line between these generations of men who really potentially, or I imagine, all equally strong, but the power that is required as it flows from one generation to another and the opening to receive it had been constricted. So that the line, in a sense, may have started off quite fat, but then it became quite thin.
Yes.
Reached the contemporary generation. Therefore, they were not resourced by the power they needed to live their life.
Exactly. And the word resourced actually is another way in which we use the line. So we often have a generational line behind an individual for purposes of diagnosis. But often, I don't know how often you do this, and I come and go in how much I use it. If a representative is, for whatever reason, struggling in a constellation, fear, anxiety, self-doubt, and so on, I will often select a representative from around the circle as a resource to that individual, and that resource will come in directly behind the struggling individual. So that's I suppose it's a line, it's a very short line. There might be a better word for that, dyad, because it's almost like a pairing, both facing in the same way. And increasingly, actually, just on a technical point, increasingly I will ask the representative themselves to choose somebody from the circle. And I'll just say, just pick somebody. I won't say what they're being invited to pick. I'll just say, just instinctively pick somebody from the circle. That person will come and stand behind them. They'll feel a change. I might ask them to turn around to look at the person behind them, and they see immediately, oh yeah, this is what I need. It might be a person, of course, it's my grandmother, or it might be a thing, that's courage, or it might be the job I too readily abandoned. But that's a kind of shortened circle we often get.
Now, it's interesting because we agree about most things.
Yeah.
And we don't do that these days. So that's interesting difference and point. And so it's asking me to think about why I don't do it. And I guess because I look for the resource to come, so basically a flow of resource to come through the movements and the sentences that will be used. So really, I'm aiming to get to the same place as you, but I just don't necessarily do it through a representation. So that's an interesting, just different personal preference.
And that's fascinating, Nicola, because it makes me want to enumerate, I suppose, the tools that we have in our kit bag as constellators. Maybe another conversation to be had there, but that's the question, isn't it? What we bring in, what we don't bring in, what other experiences, how much further information we elicit from the client, and so on. And
different experiences. And I know people who actually do much more kind of therapeutic work in a constellation in terms of emotional discharge and expression. And I know that, and I know its place, but I don't specifically do it I don't specifically push for that in a constellation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So coming back to shapes, we talked about lines a little bit. We talked about circles a little bit. We talked about triangles a little bit. You touched on the square. I think a square as such, like a perfect square, in my experience, is pretty rare as a setup. You get it. You and I will sometimes do what's called in the trade a structural constellation, where somebody has a choice to make between, say, 4 things. Should I move north, east, south, or west, for example? And then you might have a sort of very clear square. You sort of do have a square if there is a second child born into a family, where the triangle sort of becomes a square, but still it's more like, I don't know what the shape is. Is that rhomboid? I'm not quite sure.
Desperate to say the word rhombus.
Please say it. I'm glad you did.
But I'm struggling to remember exactly its defined shape. But let's just say I'm sure it's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to say, you're talking about the square, and you've helped me illuminate. A square also can contain 2 triangles.
Ah, yes, very good.
Because you have 2 parents, let's say 2 children, but then you often get these different sort of relationships that develop.
You do, and it reminds me of a constellation I did many years ago about a man who'd been offered a job in a different country, and they had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and it drove a wedge essentially between this family, which was almost literally set up as a kind of happy rhombus to begin with. But the decision which he took to move to the other country with the son, leaving the wife home with the daughter, created a polarity, essentially 2 poles. They became not in the psychological sense, a bipolar family. And over time, the visits between the 2 countries, because it involved a flight, to go to the visits became less and less frequent. So as if the family divided into 2. Of course, there were systemic reasons, why that happened. There had been sort of repetitions, earlier instances of that in the past, but it was quite affecting for me, I remember, because it was both sad, but also, in a way, it allowed both halves of the family to find a new way forward somehow. So that the rhombus that they'd been before, in retrospect, had seemed a little bit claustrophobic for them. So this move abroad was, in a way, sort of breathing life into all of them. I mean, it was harder actually for the son who moved. It was hardest for him, but it was okay. But that was quite an interesting, talking about shapes. The rhombus split in this case not into 2 triangles, or the square didn't split into 2 triangles, but it kind of divided, almost like a cellular division, with these 2 people then occupying different places in different countries.
And I think that's an interesting, just an internal perspective in a constellation way about people who manage different cultural flows within themselves, different localities. There is a shape to that as well. They often talk about wanting to return, quote, home to either a country related to a parent or a country of origin, and it's part of their inner shape. I think we all have an inner shape. Our body is a shape, so we're building shapes upon shapes.
That reminds me of a constellation I ran where somebody was trying to decide where to live. She was divorced, her children were growing up. She had more choice, I suppose, as to where to live than she'd had for a long, long time. And essentially, it became a choice between 3 parts of the United Kingdom. I won't identify any further than that, to keep it confidential. But what was so interesting is that we chose representatives who didn't know what they were representing, and they went into precisely the geographical place on the map that they should have been. So, somewhere far in the north, somewhere a little bit further south, and somewhere much further south, and, almost literally sort of mapped it out. So we had it was a kind of dog's leg shape, actually, but that shape was a geographical shape. And it was beautiful to behold. And it did remind me, I suppose, that constellations obviously is a temporal art, but it's very much a spatial art. It is where we are in space. It's sort of as if where precedes who.
Yes. And I think it's interesting because we talk about martial arts. Martial arts move in space. They understand space. They understand shapes. They understand lines. And constellations, it's more an art than a science, I would suggest. And but it has that spatial, it's very much interested in how we manage space, inner space, outer space, relationship space, emerging forward space. You know, do we feel we have permission to actually step forward, or do we feel we have to constrict ourselves back into only an ancestral space?
Yeah, I love that. We don't have a whole lot of time left, Nicola, but I want to pick up on that and relate it to something you said earlier about 3 dimensions, because the other shape we have is, as it were, the skyline in the constellation, you know, different heights within it. And then one other thing about the shape of the human body, which can also be mapped in a constellation. So the first thing about, obviously people arrive, they're different heights naturally anyway in constellation. So when they stand, you see that. But for me, it's often the case that people get resized a bit during a constellation. You know, people who are a bit too big for their boots often shrink a bit, like a sort of Constellations Alice in Wonderland potion. And people who arrive a little bit too small for their boots grow a bit. And you can, I mean, people who've never done constellations will think I am insane as I speak about this, but you can almost literally see people changing size within a constellation, I think. And it reminds me, I think this is another Hellinger thing. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's the sentiment is we become greatest by becoming most equal, or something like that.
Yes.
Do you remember that? Yeah.
Absolutely, but always drilled down to I'm the same as you and you are the same as me.
Yeah.
And I would say that is, particularly in our times that we are currently in, that is one of the great gifts of participating in constellations, is at the end of a constellation, I feel absolutely flooded with a warm humanity and compassion for everyone else's lives and history, and in a little bit my own.
Yeah.
I'm as humble as anyone else.
Yes. I mean, I love that sort of paradox, but you sort of grow by not being too big.
Grow by becoming connected rather than separate.
Yeah. Yeah. One final thing to touch on, then we really must wrap up. I don't know if you've done this. I've done it not often, but you know, occasionally people present with health issues. Of course they do. And you know, one will often look at systemic reasons for that. You know, if this is a symptom, what's it a symptom of? Who are you carrying it for? How has it been transmitted through the family system unconsciously, and so on. But a few times I have set up the client's body. You know, so we've had a representative for the head, the torso, the legs, and so on. And so we get a human shape as opposed to a geographical shape, and it's worked pretty well. I mean, I don't know why I'm surprised by it, but it can work for, you know, I remember doing it for one woman with sciatica, for example, persistent sciatica, you know, which obviously manifested somewhere in the kind of lower back, but actually the problem turned out to be the foot, you know, and that's where, so it's quite an interesting way of using constellations just to help to look at, you know, where things had come, not in a particularly systemic way genealogically, but systemic in terms of the body and what was carrying what for whom. Then, of course, we went to look at the foot and what that was carrying systemically. And of course, that took us then down a genealogical route. But just wanted to add that in, you know, in case you'd ever had any similar experience with that.
Yes, I have. I've done it with internal organs. I've done it, that's by having the organs speak to each other, which is why we've both probably taught a couple of doctors, and they're very, it comes quite easily to them, systemic work, because they understand that if someone comes in with swollen feet, it's not often that they have, you know, or lower legs, a foot problem, it's a heart problem. Yeah. So they understand the sort of flow between the different systems. So I think it's, you know, it is quite interesting to have your organs speak to you.
Yes.
At which point we've probably lost half our audience now.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
It's fine. We're happy talking. So, yes. But I think what you're alluding to is the fact that we have so many possibilities with constellations, with shape and with where we place the boundary and where we place the focus.
Exactly.
So I think it's time now, isn't it? Yes. So thank you to all our listeners and viewers. If you could like and subscribe, that keeps us motivated. And if you would like to contact Robert, you'll find him at robertrowlandsmith.com, and you'll find me at nicoladunnconstellations.com. And we hope to see you again. Thank you.